Racelessness, and I'm here today with Violette. Is it Simard?
Yes.
Simard, who is finding a place in theory of racelessness and also has some questions for me. And really, I'm just hoping to learn from her what speaks to her in anything that I'm offering and sharing with the world, and why. And then also hoping to answer any questions that she may have, as well as answering questions from the audience in the live chat. So if you're here during the live, sound off in the live chat. Let me know what you're thinking and what questions you have regarding my theory of racelessness. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Violette to introduce herself. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. My name is Violette. I'm from Montreal, Quebec. I am 23 years old, and I've recently graduated from McGill University with a bachelor's in political science and international development. And I'll hopefully be starting my master's next September in cultural studies in London at Goldsmiths University. And yes, I'm really excited to be here with Dr. Sheena.
Are you in Montreal right now?
Yes.
Oh, nice. I've been hearing from so many people not in the United States, and it's overwhelming actually, because when you start sharing your ideas and thinking out loud, you're not thinking, I hope to have a global impact, right? Like you're happy if 5 people pay attention to you. Right. So that's so interesting. And we're close neighbors, I would say. I went to undergrad in Plattsburgh, New York, and from Plattsburgh, I would go to Burlington, and then we'd take the ferry over into Canada. So I feel like we're close neighbors.
Yeah.
So first of all, I'll ask you this. How did you get introduced to my work? Did you stumble upon a video? Did you see me on Twitter? Like, how did this connection happen?
So I stumbled upon your work during this past summer. So starting June, I would say, I was going through this like transformation in my Black consciousness, we can say. I was really looking to like start from scratch and really leave everything I have accumulated so far. And so I was kind of listening to people I wouldn't normally go listen to, like Candace Owens. I discovered Coleman Hughes, Brittany King, Kimi Katiti, Dr. Jordan Peterson. I think I'm forgetting someone else. John McWhorter, people all in that, like I guess, Black conservative category, I would say. And so I was watching Brittany King's video, and I think the one you did with her. And when I saw that video, I was like, oh my gosh, this is everything I knew intuitively, but couldn't quite put the words to it. And it confirmed that it was okay to think that way, because for the longest time, I felt worried to share my true opinions, I guess, on race, just because I think the mainstream narrative is so powerful at the moment. And the second you step against that, you're labeled as racist, coon, all sorts of ridiculous insults, basically. And so, yes, it was super refreshing to see this theory. And it also echoed very much the way I was raised, being mixed. So yes, I really appreciated finding the theory of racelessness.
Yeah, when you said June, I was thinking it had to have been my collab with Brittany, because that was one of the first things that I did. Yeah. And so that's cool. You've really been with us since day one then. And you've stayed. So I take that as a good sign.
It's a good sign.
Yeah, what you just said resonates with me for countless reasons, including the fact that I'm intentional about exposing myself to voices that 2-3 years ago I would have presumed, they're not going to say anything that's going to land well with me, and I think part of that fear, I was just talking about this with Kevin. We'd have this monthly podcast. That podcast just came out. It's live on the channel. We were talking about the role of media, and I was telling him candidly that I had a sort of phase, if you will, of fearing, what does it mean for me to see the value in what these other voices are saying? because the way race gets produced and the way people think, particularly about Blackness, it is very limiting and constricting, and it's a no-go, for one to be quote unquote Black and to think outside of the mainstream narrative. And it seems to matter, being conservative and Black, and especially being Republican and Black, that's an entirely other thing, though it still is caused by racism. But like John McWhorter isn't conservative by his own estimation. He doesn't identify as conservative, though he understands, and I understand how he gets cast as conservative. And I'm not conservative on the books. I'm a registered independent. And yet people would want me to be conservative to dismiss everything I'm saying.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So what was it that you said that this journey to exposing yourself to other voices and stuff started because you had a desire to expand your conception of Black consciousness, as you called it? Mm-hmm. Well, how were you defining Black consciousness then, or how are you defining it now? And what was the genesis for, or the inspiration for, like, I need to expand how I'm thinking about this thing?
Mm-hmm. So I still don't know how I would define Black consciousness to this day. I think from what I've witnessed, it's associated with, finding some sort of, I guess, how could I say, associating with the history of slavery, colonization, all that stuff. And then also subscribing to the idea that as Black people, we are still oppressed and victims of white supremacy. So this definition is what I've noticed a lot of people adhere to. And although I really tried to stick with it, but I couldn't, because first of all, I am not a victim. I don't view myself as being oppressed at all. And also, I think this relationship we have to history is a little problematic in the sense that we take it so personally instead of viewing history as simply the timeline of human life. And so naturally it is going to be flawed and naturally it's going to be messed up, but that's because that's who we are as humans, and we need to stop making a value judgment with 21st century mindset, right? And so during my studies, I focused a lot on colonial history and legacies of colonialism. And I was noticing the way we speak about colonialism, it's as though it happened in a vacuum. Like we say, kingdoms in West Africa were rich and powerful, and then all of a sudden, European explorers came and destroyed everything. And I was kind of like, we're missing a step here. Like, if these kingdoms were as powerful and rich as we say they were, how were they so easily, like, just destroyed this way? And I did a lot of research and discovered that these were human relations, like business relations, that obviously took a left turn. But I mean, it was still people that had to deal with greed and power. And that's how it got to where it got to. And I'm essentializing right now, I'm simplifying tremendously. But once I discovered these things, I started to question the way I interpreted history and just try to be as objective as I was. And that's kind of what got the ball rolling into changing my whole perspective on everything.
Yeah, that's a journey I'm constantly going down, right? Because one can never know everything, even though I try to know everything. And I know a lot, but I don't know everything.
Right.
But that's something I've been exploring. And I was just talking with Ada Kapala on my channel about this topic, and it's something that's increasingly coming up. And when I hear people bring up the complexity of human history, right, which is really what you're saying you discovered for yourself, which that complexity then inspired you to think more critically about how you were translating particular histories. But I get this, I don't get the sense people would push back and say, well, but that doesn't justify, right, European enslavement and chattel slavery and all of that, which
Really?
I don't think many people are trying to say that it justifies how things happen, right? But what I really hear and how I think about it for myself is there's a way in which whiteness as a racial concept has been constructed as being violent, thieving, murderous. You know, a professor from Rutgers University put it as these, you know, white people with their vile, murderous, treacherous selves came over and interrupted Black and brown brilliance. These are her words. And just like threw everything off. And now we have to wait for whiteness to end its reign, but it will end its reign. And Black and brown people can basically go back to being as beautiful and brilliant as they've always been. And I'm like, wait a second, like that's one way to analyze history, right? It's one way to interpret it. But another way to interpret it would be, the more you know about human history, the more you recognize that doing all of the things that get assigned to whiteness is a human problem, right? It's an aspect of humanity. It's the darkest parts of humanity. It's the darkest part of ourselves. And I think that's what makes it hard and really difficult for most people to acknowledge and admit, right? It's always the other guy who's violent and doing wrong. But if we actually understand history on a more complex level and get outside of the Black and white binary, to me, it's eye-opening, because it really does demonstrate that all of us are human. Exactly. Good, bad, and ugly, right?
Exactly. And I think pointing the finger at others and going into this like white is evil, Black is amazing, is just absolving yourself from any responsibility of any of your human characteristics, right? You can't do that. Like, we're people. Everybody has their own flaws, their own shortcomings, what have you, but we need to have a certain level of empathy to understand it without necessarily completely dismissing the atrocities that happen, right? And that is a slippery slope to navigate. It's a thin line, but I think you need to give it a try. Otherwise, you're just getting a very limited version of life, right?
Yeah, of oneself and of other people. And I think that's part of the dangers of how things are currently going, at least in the States. And I'm hearing it's going similarly in Canada as well as the UK. Unfortunately, I don't think the similarities in terms of the cultural shift are positive. But that's some of the dangers, because in a way, at least in the context of the States, there's this urging of so-called white folks to accept the shame and guilt from what their ancestors did, essentially, and also recognize how here and now today they benefit from racism, both historically and contemporarily. And at the same time that so-called white people are being urged to do all this self-flagellating stuff, right. Racialized Black and brown people are encouraged to, as you said, look at themselves more so through a sort of victim lens or victimized lens. But then also, it's like, on the one hand, I understand the logic of it, or at least I understand the sentiment of it, the sentiment of trying to write empowerment into this thing one could call Black consciousness and Black identity, right? So that we can't, with that effort to empower, one cannot or should not acknowledge their own sins, the ancestors, their own atrocities committed by their own ancestors, right? Because then that would contradict the effort to write whiteness in a particular way and get white people to feel a particular way, and so on and so forth. And so I see this really nefarious quagmire of constantly constantly trying to write each other out of humanity,
Mhm.
right? Because with writing whiteness in a particular way, there is a way in which the goodness of humanity is left out of that equation. And then for writing blackness in a particular way, the badness is left out of the equation.
Mhm.
Yeah, you go ahead.
This reminds me of, well, Shelby Steele, the content of a character written by Shelby Steele. I think he describes this dynamic perfectly, in which he explains that in this duality of white and black, you also have the dynamic between innocent and guilty. And by labeling white people as guilty, black people by default are innocent. And in that way, they're the better of the two. And so that empowers you. So putting, paradoxically, situating yourself as a victim gives you power, and power to say who's good and who's bad. And I think in that, this, it allows you to kind of, how can I put it? I think you've put it very well, like you put it very perfectly in an article where you're saying, well, it gives me the power as a Black person to mistreat, insult anybody that isn't like me because I have been oppressed for all these years. So I have the right to say all these things. But then if somebody else does it to you, it's like the most terrible thing ever. And that makes no sense. We're stuck in these paradoxical, like, dynamics with each other that just they're not sustainable, and they're not constructive at all.
It just keeps the wheels of racism turning, and in some ways exactly, and in some ways people are saying it inspires racism, because where there weren't ill feelings before, for some people ill feelings are starting to be created. And I've seen a lot of people racialized as Asian speaking out against what's happening and how they feel like this is impacting their family and their future generations. People who are Jewish are coming out and speaking out against this ideology because it undermines and devalues and diminishes the oppression that Jewish people have faced historically, right, and now. And it's inspiring anti-Semitism. So there's a way in which it's pretending to solve the problems and the problem of racism, and it's pretending to reconcile. But I'm starting to wonder if it is even pretending to reconcile. You mentioned John McWhorter. Glenn Lowry is probably a name you're familiar with. So I don't know if you are subscribed to his Substack, but my friend Charles at Kokotu on Critical African Thinkers channel recently did a response to Glenn Lowry's most recent publication. And essentially in the publication, or with the publication, Glenn does an audio, and he's imagining a response to a person who wrote into him pretending to be Simone, a student. And Simone is saying, okay, you know, if what racialized Black people want is empowerment, regardless of how we get there, what's happening now is a form of empowerment. And the writer mentions, you know, there's increased over representation in that person's words in different spaces and social media and different medias, and now increasing representation in companies and industries and all of the things. And so went down this list of how we're doing things, although imperfect, it's getting the result that many racialized Black people would want. The Black middle class is increasing, this person says. And so why should we do it a different way if this is actually doing the good? And Glenn's response, put very reductively, was something like, when getting power or holding power requires somebody else to be giving you that power, right? In this instance, racialized white people or organizations run and maintained by racialized white people who are right now feeling guilty, but at a shift in the wind, then the tables can turn, right? And it's not a sustained increasing of power because how it happened was sort of superficial and not really solving some of the systemic cultural and political issues. And so that's not the same as increasing power or being empowered. So that makes me question more and more what people's intentions are, because it seems like reconciliation might be something they say they want, but it seems like that's not the goal. Mm-hmm. Right. And if that's not the goal, and if it really is just like a sort of power grab and an attempt to shift the power, then that makes voices like yours and mine, number one, I think that much more important, but also seemingly like we have a really ginormous mountain to climb.
Yeah.
Because people feel like they're getting what they want. And I'm like, no, but we can get what we want, have it actually be sustainable, as you said, and stem the problem from persisting in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Chopping it at the root, basically.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Because otherwise, kind of like what Glenn Lowry said, what's the point? It's only going to be temporary. And then, God forbid, the tides do shift back or somehow reverse. And then what happens, right?
That's quite a conundrum. Well, I think these kind of like superficial power grabs they're working because it's like instant gratification. You get what you want in that moment, but then we'll just get a shift, like you said, like the tides will change, and we'll be still stuck in the same problem. Like nothing would have changed. What would have changed is who's in power and who isn't. That's it. And I think for fundamental change, we need to stop looking at these labels and just look at the people behind them, right? Instead of saying, well, white is this, black is that, and I'm hiring you as a black person because I need to fill a quota. Well, the qualifications of that person are disregarded the same way your character is in these everyday relationships. I don't know if I made any sense whatsoever. But like nothing truly changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like how this helps uphold the problem of racism comes down to this idea, this insistence that diversity is based largely on how a person looks. Mm-hmm. And we know that there's a way in which one can be politically Black. That's the language people assign to it. And that being politically Black is basically being the opposite of every person you named at the start of the conversation, which basically means like being Democrat, being left, being progressive, being liberal, like all of those things that somehow come to be synonymous with Blackness and how being Black is understood and demanded of people in really ironic ways. And it's I think probably the most unfortunate part of all this is how this started. It was really started, it being this production of Blackness in these very sort of narrow ways, it really started out of the desire to protect racialized Black people. You know, this was during the era of when minstrelsy was still a thing, when there were really vicious, racist images and depictions of so-called Black people circulating and being consumed by the larger public and being presumed to be, this is how so-called Black people are, right? And in response to that, you have people doing civil rights movements and also participating in literary and artistic productions leading up to the Harlem Renaissance and through the Harlem Renaissance. And their main objective was to counteract those racist depictions of so-called Black people. And so the narrowness of how Blackness came to be produced and consumed in America, to me, is really complex, because if you understand the history and what's going on at the time, lynchings, all the things, then you understand there was a real material danger and violence that people were responding to. And so to protect so-called Black people, then you had to vote a certain way, right? You had to think a certain way. You had to present yourself a certain way. And that's where respectability politics and all of that comes into play. But at the same time that discourse and those efforts are happening, you have other people participating in the same civil rights efforts who are doing it from almost the exact opposite side of the spectrum, where they're recognizing that the viciousness gets carried through the idea of race. And so they're arguing against the existence of race itself to counter the racist depictions that are being promoted and accepted. And for everyone, whether you're an eliminativist skepticist, or if you're a constructionist reconstructionist, or a naturalist conservationist, all of these people knew what was at stake. And the voices that won over the sort of mainstream were the voices that were saying, okay, race exists. They were accepting Blackness, and they were trying to just rewrite it and reconstruct it. But in that way, they weren't, it's sketch, because in that way they were going against the mainstream narrative, which was the racist depictions. But at the same time, they weren't going against the mainstream in the sense that they weren't being radical in terms of what they imagined, how they imagined themselves as human, necessarily without Blackness, without the label, without the race, box being checked. And so in 2021, when you have people still trying to write humanity into Blackness, and you think about this history and you think about, okay, this is the battle that people have literally always been trying to have in the United States, especially, and some other places. It's like, at what point are we going to recognize that it's being packaged as progressive and liberal, this race consciousness, right? The race pride, Black nationalism, Black pride, Black power, Black excellence, Black beauty, Black boy joy. All of those things are being packaged as liberal. But since the very beginning, it's been a losing battle, because race was created in the way that it was created because of racism. Mm-hmm. And so we're convincing ourselves time and again that the best effort that we can take is to reconstruct racism
in a positive manner, like to spin it.
Right.
That's a fine line that I still don't know how to navigate to this day. And I think that's a question. One of the questions I have for you is, how would someone who would subscribe to what you just described, how would we get them to understand theory of racelessness, to get them to see that, like, throwing away the label doesn't mean you're throwing away, like, the culture that you love and embrace so much? Like, how do you negotiate that?
Listen, Violette, if you figure that out, I have a place for you in theory of racelessness. No, so it's probably the hardest part of my work, because people who are Pan-Africanist or just like pretty far over on that side of the spectrum do have a more challenging journey to really grapple with the ideas and what it is that I'm saying, because I think the sort of default presumption for most people who enter this space, well, I can't say for most people, but for many people, is that I created theory of racelessness to coddle and appease and alleviate white guilt and white shame. Right. And I've been accused of being anti-Black, only by one person, fortunately, but my Newsweek article inspired some ire and some misunderstanding. And it's super ironic to me, because what started me on this journey was actually my sincere love for people racialized as Black. And it was my interest in intragroup dynamics and discourse and fractures, and specifically my interest in helping resolve those fractures, that led me down the path of my research to my conclusions, so that the last thing on my mind, and this is racism and racialist ideology playing its trick on us, quite literally the last thing on my mind was so-called white people and what they thought about anything I had to say, or what they thought about people who look like me, right? But it can be easy to miss, and it's easy to misunderstand, because when I talk about racelessness, especially if a racialized Black person is engaging or hearing my messaging, the first thing that's automatically on the chopping block is this thing called Blackness. And because Blackness has been produced in the way that it has, it's also been produced to embody everything positive, like we were saying earlier, like literally everything positive a person can imagine about themselves. We tend to assign it to Blackness and assign it to our race in that way. And it's had practical utility. That practice and those beliefs have had practical utility. I think they still have some forms of practical utility in a, unsustainable way, but there's still some utility there. And so how I help people step outside of those bounds and expand how they think about this thing is helping them recognize that because one assigns everything positive to Blackness in this example, I'm literally only talking about removing the violence, right? I'm talking about racism masquerading itself as race, or race, and I'm talking about how race gets conflated with culture and ethnicity, other meaningful things. So when I talk about undoing race to undo racism, I'm not talking about undoing culture or undoing ethnicity, because after all, I'm saying we need to stop conflating race with ethnicity and culture. So those things are untouched. And in terms of how racism masquerades itself as race, I would be hard pressed to find somebody who would be like, no, I want to hold on to racism. No, like, let me keep that. Oh, it's like, and once I articulate it in that way and help people do what I think is really emotional and spiritual work to disentangle everything that's meaningful to them from what I'm actually talking about undoing, then it pays off tenfold. And the vast majority of people feel compelled and understand, because the evidence is really, it's for the most part, it's indisputable. Even if you disagree with a particular aspect of my idea or what I think, the core of the theory of racelessness is indisputable when you have certain evidence in front of you, for most people, right? And I try to remember that this isn't about convincing every person.
That's true.
Because I think that's part of the problematics of what's happening in our societies now. It's like this mission to get every person to think the same about this one thing, racism. And while that feels right, and it feels just, and it feels like justice and progress, I really do think that's the antithesis to the sort of freer society that I'm striving for myself and my children.
Sorry, Dr. Sheena, just a second. I'll be right back. I'm sorry.
No problem. It's okay. While she steps away, I'm going to go in the chat box. Hi, Steve. Hey, Keisha. Mike the dad Crosby. So good to see you here. And Chloe, thank you. Oh, welcome back. I was just saying hi to people who are talking in the chat box.
That's good. I had to kick out my cat as predicted. He snuck in. I'm sorry about that.
No worries at all, truly. Campbell Dynasty is asking if you have a channel, Violette.
I don't have a YouTube channel, no. Not yet. Maybe at some point. I have an upcoming Substack publication though. So that'll be up soon. I mean, it's up. I just don't have any articles on it yet.
Excellent. Well, after the talk, definitely share the link with me. I'll put it in the description box. So folks, you'll have to come back to get that information, but happy to share and promote your work.
Thank you.
So I'm trying to, Oh yeah, so yeah, most people feel compelled, and I just keep in mind that this isn't a zero-sum game, so not every person has to agree. And I don't think that every person should agree. Even as much as I know how right I am, right? I don't I think I don't know, it's something is detracted from the idea of everyone agreeing on anything, even this one thing. But I will say that the statistical majority is the key. Getting the statistical majority of people unlearning and then relearning certain different things and alternative philosophies. And with that, I do think it'll get to a point where fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer racist incidents will happen. Racism will no longer be viewed as something that is systemic, and because we'll actually be solving the problems. And other hierarchies will certainly continue to exist and persist. So I'm not imagining a paradise, my head is not in the clouds. But I think as far as racism and the power that it has right now in our societies, I see that as really dropping down to being minuscule, even if not every person agrees. And then who knows what the future could look like in a couple generations, 3 generations, 4 generations, where we're not teaching race anymore, which means we're not teaching racism. I would just imagine at some point the entire society would probably shift accordingly, and I think that would be a good thing.
Definitely. I asked also because when I first discovered the theory, I was really happy. And then my first thought was like, well, you can afford to think this way because of the circumstances you're in, because I'm mixed. All of my environments that I move through are multicultural. So I could afford to navigate my world with a certain neutrality, right? So the theory of racelessness was very appropriate in that sense. But then how do I make sure I don't come off as invalidating someone's very real experiences with racism in their daily lives? So I and to this day I still it's a work in progress, but I don't know how to deliver this without sounding preachy or holier than thou, right? Because I'm often dismissed as being an exception, as being because your circumstances are different than mine, da 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 da. And so my message gets lost in that, right?
Yes, I hear you. I've had a couple people racialized as white reach out to me and ask me the question of, how do I share this knowledge as a white person, right? As a person who's perceived as being racist without being automatically dismissed as being racist. And that is the quagmire caused by racialist ideology. The fact that anyone else talking, if they're upholding the mainstream narrative, we'll say, they're not preaching. They're not on their soapbox. They're just spitting facts, right? But then because we have an alternative way of looking at this thing, we feel like we're preaching, or we're taking up space, or we're talking too much, and then add to that the fact that there are really valid concerns in terms of how people are going to receive what you're saying. I put it this way to some students last year. Part of the process is really a learning curve, and it requires a learning curve, because I think the way that you learn how to package information best and better is through being bold enough to speak, right? I think it really starts there, because it was in my, audacity to speak and to share my ideas that I was able to get feedback. And when I got feedback, fortunately, I'm blessed to engage with people who more often than not ask questions, right? They ask me follow-up questions, or they'll say something that will signal to me, oh, they're actually completely misconstruing what I'm saying. And then they're giving me an opportunity to expand, right? And I can't recall a time where anyone was just like, anyone that I know personally that I would have these conversations with, that where anyone was like, oh, just, screw her, she's racist, and I'm not going to talk to you anymore. And I've been fortunate, but it's also required a lot of patience on my end. Mm-hmm. It's required a lot of grace on everyone participating's end. And it's required a fair amount of practice. Like, I've gotten so many reps at saying what I think, which has also given me the confidence and the motivation to keep speaking. And I've come to package it in a way that I guess lands better with more people, or at least makes people more open. Mm-hmm. Also, I will say this too. I remember one student asked me a year ago if I thought this way because of colorism. Like, did I have basically light skin privilege?
Right.
And it makes me giggle because it really goes back to this idea that one's race determines one's ideas. And just think about how nonsensical. I think that's personally nonsensical, and not I don't mean to be pejorative or dismissive. Truly, I don't. But I think if you said that out loud to people, it would encourage them to question, like, oh, wait, yeah, that is kind of ironic, isn't it? I've experienced explicit racism. Mm-hmm. So my light skin has not precluded me from experiencing physical violence and verbal, attacks of people calling me pubic hair, the N-word, Oreo, spitting on me, assaulting me on the school bus, you name it. I experienced it. My adopted brother was shot at by a skinhead. We grew up in a trailer park, and one of the teenagers in the trailer park was at least allegedly a skinhead, and he shot a real gun at my brother and a neighbor who's also a racialized Black kid. And my brother came home screaming bloody murder. We're like 9 years old, screaming bloody murder. I'll probably remember that forever. Presumably I would. I've lived the actual racism, and I've experienced and witnessed the result of systemic racism through my work for Teacher for America, for Freedom Summer Collegiate. I've seen what the history and the legacy of slavery and enslavement in this country looks like, how it impacts young people to this day. And yet I still think what I think.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a strong indicator.
I still think what I think. And this desire to dismiss because a person is racialized a particular way, as white, or racialized as mixed, as you said. I want to ask you to define that, by the way. Sure. You're on the hot seat. Sure. It's like, that should not be how what we say is being measured or valued. Mm-hmm. What we say and the evidence we bring to the table, should carry some weight, regardless of how we look or how you think I'm racialized. So listen, just all I can say is feel heartened to know that the circle seems very small. It's like the names you listed earlier are names I know. I could have guessed that they were going to come up in conversation. It seems like a very small circle. Yeah. But the circle of people who are engaging with my ideas and ideas like mine is growing. Mm-hmm. And I think the silent majority, I'm kind of with John McWhorter in thinking that Eric Smith, a professor of rhetoric and comp. I'm with him in thinking that the silent majority are the ones who lean into ideas like ours, as opposed to the people who seem the most vocal. They're the loudest, so it seems like they're the majority, but I don't think it's so. I just think they're the loudest.
That's true. Right?
Yeah. And I'll also say, I expected a lot more pushback than I'm getting. I'm sure it's coming. The more attention I get, the more trolls I get. But I really out the gate was like nervous because I knew what I was saying wasn't going to jive with the majority of people. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know how it was going to be received, but based on my knowledge of how these things work, I was ready. You know, I was pulling up my pants and I was
Yeah,
putting on my construction hat, and I was just trying to brace myself, and
right.
I still am. But I'm telling you, people are very reasonable, and maybe it's because I communicated in a way that helps that with that, you know.
Mhm.
But overwhelmingly positive response. I can't even begin to tell you. Like when you're Substack, when you start being active on there,
Yeah.
your following is going to be massive. Like people are going to listen to you. And I think that's part of racism having its way with us too, because we know the sort of track record of how these things work. And because we see things playing out in public spaces in the ways that they do, it would encourage us to be silent. It would encourage us to silence ourselves for fear of repercussions or for fear of being misunderstood. But I'm I hope you can hear me when I say, like, be inspired, because people are going to listen to you.
Thank you. That is extremely encouraging. And I think part of the reason why I don't have any articles yet is that fear, right, of being not being received well. But no, I think I'm ready, and I'm excited to be a part of this growing circle as well.
Yes, listen, you're in the circle now, so I'm about to introduce you to
Yay!
everyone. We need to get you. Are you on Discord? The app?
No, but I think my mom told me I should get on it or something like that. But you know what? Now I will be.
I'll send you the link to the Discord that I'm part of. It's run by Charles, the gentleman I mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
and it's just a bunch of people desiring to have conversations and learn from each other, and share their knowledge and insight in civil, ways. And it's people really from all over the world. So I definitely encourage you to join. And it's also a space to share your work too, which people are going to be very supportive of. Um, so I want to invite you to also ask, oh no, mixed.
Mixed.
I want
Yeah.
to go back to the hot seat. So how are you meaning mixed when you say that about yourself?
Okay, so when I describe myself as being mixed, I always say I am mixed in every sense of the word, genetically, culturally, and also in terms of my personality. So my mother is from Jamaica. My dad is half white, half Lebanese, and so yeah, that's my cultural ethnic heritage, I guess. And my household was very multicultural. My neighborhood, the schools I went to, my friend circles. So I'm always submerged in this diverse, just world, I guess. And so because of that, I was always told to never, ever, ever put any weight on the color of my skin. What matters is who I am. And some people will try to treat me according to the color of my skin, but to always remember it's not about me, it's about them, right? So that was my my life motto. But then of course it was challenging when you come to the playground with that mentality, but others don't. So you're challenged with others like inability to put you in a box like the people are so quick to do, and when they can't, then they just don't know what to do with you, and it comes off in the way they treat you. So it was challenging, but I have to say my biggest challenge was being accepted by my Black peers, because I didn't correspond to certain stereotypes, ironically, or because I didn't have maybe similar interests. I was easily cast aside. And so to compensate, I adopted the woke mentality to kind of fit in more. But yes, so without going off on a tangent, that's what I mean by being mixed. I just literally am.
Yeah, I welcome the tangent. Talk to me about woke
About that,
mentality.
yes. So yeah, so as I mentioned before, I never really paid any attention to I guess my race. It was never a thing, and I never made it a thing until I really was trying to belong with my black peers, and because I didn't get the reaction I thought I would, I opted to just adopt the Black strife and really started walking around with a chip on my shoulder. I was very confrontational and not very, yeah, I started to test my non-Black friends and to see, their reactions, and, oh, is it because I'm Black and you guys need to, really check your privilege and stuff like that. And I adopted that kind of behavior for maybe 2 months until my mom sat me down and said, cut it out, because this is not something you should take on. This is not how I raised you. And you don't know what it's like to navigate the world as a Black person naturally, because you aren't. You're mixed, and that's how you were brought up. So you don't necessarily know what it means. My mom is dark-skinned Black woman with long dreadlocks, and she told me, you've seen me go through certain things that you will never have to go through. So don't try to pretend like you do, and don't take that on unnecessarily. And so it took me, it was a hard pill to swallow, but once I did, I was happy, because I felt like there was a weight off my shoulder, a weight that I chose. And once I chose to put it back down, I felt better. My relationship with other people felt way better, and with myself, more importantly. And so that was, I'm condensing. It was a long journey, but that's what it was essentially.
Yeah, and that experience that you just described is not an uncommon experience, and it doesn't always, because some people like to make it about being mixed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Put that in quotation marks. Some
Yeah.
people would hear your story and say, oh yes, essentially assign some kind of privilege to you because of your mixed status. And again, that to me is a really nefarious way of dealing with people's ideas, and recognizing that people, even people who might have been mixed by American and apparently Canadian standards, who don't look phenotypically mixed, right? Who don't have lighter skin, or the sort of stereotypical image, Playhouse and stuff in the background, stereotypical image of what a quote unquote mixed person looks like. They don't look mixed, but they still can and often do, and have had historically had and shared the same ideas in the same ways, and the same similar experiences and the same ways of viewing things. And people who aren't mixed by the one drop rule sort of standards, also share those other philosophies of race and ways of seeing oneself and moving through the world. But a quick and easy way to dismiss a person's ideas is to say, oh, well, it's because they're mixed that they think this, or it's because they have lighter skin and they think this, or it's because they're white and they think this, or it's because they're conservative and they think this. We just keep finding excuses not to listen to these other ideas, so that the sort of perimeter for the voices that we can listen to or should listen to is so small and so not reflective of reality. Because in reality, I think it's a falsehood for people to think that even the majority of racialized Black people think a particular way about anything. I think that our viewpoint diversity in the world is just way more vast and, more comprehensive than people would presume, because there are ideas circulating of this is, if you think this way, you're trying to be white, or you're trying to increase your proximity to whiteness. I saw that in a video recently. And the person was saying, get this. So it was a conversation about CRT, and the person was saying, an advocate and a CRT educator. Okay. And they were saying that a person can happen to be white and a person can be white. And then when she said what she meant was a person can be white as in they're born and they're racially white. And a person can happen to be white as in they're not born racially white, but if they disagree with CRT, it's because they hate themselves and they hate non-white people, and they're trying to increase their proximity to whiteness because they've internalized racism. And so that they happen to be white. And I'm like,
I hear that. That's a popular thing to say. That's a popular, believe it or not, that's very popular. And it's
I
like
know.
anybody who's an inconvenience to your ideology is just completely dismissed, because I think, for example, people like us, I would say, we challenge this universality of Black experience. And so because we challenge that, we're then tossed aside and dismissed as being, oh, it's because we're light skins, because we're mixed, blah, blah, blah. Because otherwise they would be forced to really face the inconsistencies and like how incoherent the mainstream narrative is. And so instead of sitting down and really saying, okay, what's the matter? No, it's like, you're the problem, not my ideas, right?
Exactly. It is very prevalent and common, it being those types of ideas. And so when people say things to me such as there's nothing negative about being white or being Black, or, there's nothing negative about being racialized, I'm like,
come again.
You're right. It's kind of like, where do I start in terms of expanding a person's knowledge? But then the interesting thing too is like, people can have the same knowledge. We could read the same set of books, but come away with completely different conclusions. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the problem of all of this too. It's like we could have the same knowledge, but just disagree on the conclusions. But, to my mind and to my mentor's mind, he happens to be a constructionist eliminativist. And I mentioned him incessantly because my skepticism in particular is something that's harder for many people to get their heads around, but one needed to be a skeptic to be an eliminativist. And if we're both eliminativists, then we share in that goal. So it doesn't really matter if we agree or disagree on the reality or non-reality of race, right? So my social constructionist mentor says it very succinctly: there's nothing positive about being racialized. And it didn't have to be that way, but because our histories in the Americas played out the ways that they did, it is that way, and the word Black in other languages existed before they were co-opted to mean anything racial, right? And in that way, in other countries, it doesn't hold the weight that it holds in places like Canada or the US. It's more just it's a descriptor, and it's not taken as anything else. It's not taken as how you think or how you should be or how you are culturally or anything. It's just a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. But and in those instances, I would say, arguably, there's nothing negative about being racialized, right, as Black or white or anything else. But that's not what it is for those of us in North America, right. Apparently, that's not what it is. That's not the history that we're talking about. And something too that's bringing me back to your earlier question about how can we help have these conversations with people who identify very strongly and positively with race, and in particular with Blackness. How do we help them at least understand our perspectives, right, without writing us off? I think part of it too is like, if we could get to a place of any racial descriptor not being synonymous with racism, right? If we could get to a place of that, if that could actually be factual, if we could keep the word Black and have it mean ethnicity and culture and all the things that it's been conflated with, and not have that being racial signifier, which would then mean that you could look any type of way and be Black culturally, and you could look any type of way and look and be Black ethnically, because our DNA is way more complex than we try to pretend that it is, right? So if we got to that place, then I would say, oh yeah, I would have no problem with maintaining the words that are right now assigned to race, right? Because I'm literally just talking about the racism aspect of this conversation. I'm not talking about eliminating anything else. And part of this too that I want to take an opportunity to say is like, the benefits for people not racialized as white to step into theory of racelessness I barely have words to articulate. I've had people tell me that I'm the red pill. Like one of my recent clients, bless his heart, I love him. And if you're out there listening to this, kudos to you, brother. He told me I gave him the red pill, not in terms of like now he's a Republican or conservative, because right. I'm not even a Republican or conservative. But I think I get this sense that conservatives, when they say red pilled, they mean like flipped to the right or something. Yeah. But just the red pill from the Matrix sense, like
yes, strictly
the red pill, strictly the Matrix. Context is important. Yeah, like he took the red pill and now he can't unsee or unknow what he knows, and there's no turning back for him. And he's like, I see it everywhere, and I see how this red pill would benefit literally everyone in ways that we probably don't even know until like 50 years from now. And part of the benefit is that one thing I think should be acknowledged is one can be a victim and still see themselves outside of their victimhood. Mm-hmm. I think that's important to say, because some people hear victim and they think only victim, but I think it's more, as with everything in life, I think it's more complex. I think what you can recognize that somebody is a victim of something, and also recognize all of these other aspects and resiliency and everything else, right? But I think there's a way in which how racialist ideology makes people victims is more than how we initially presume, because part of the victimhood becomes this internalization of racism. It becomes the fact that because we are operating from inside the category, and because racism is race, we're operating in that category. And we also are encouraged to see race everywhere because color is a proxy for race. So we see race everywhere. And since it's the same thing, we see racism everywhere, right? Even where it's not. Mm-hmm. And we see there's a burden and a weight and a pain that comes along with operating in the category, because it literally is racism. And I recently did a workshop where a woman cried because I was doing my whole talk about theory of racelessness, and then I was doing a question and answer, and I gave a sort of anecdote of my experience in relationship with America, and specifically symbols of America, the American flag. And I spoke about how, because I was so entrenched in studying the problems of America, specifically as it pertains to racism, I felt this angst. And I was part of the group of people who would look at patriotism with hurt in my heart, you know, because I felt like America wasn't for me. She wasn't on my side. And I loved her. Otherwise, it wouldn't have hurt. I wouldn't have cared, right? I love America and I love this country. And I felt like I wasn't loved back, you know, and I felt like I felt something about that. And so I wouldn't, for a few years in my adult life, I wouldn't celebrate the 4th of July. And when I had my triplets, who are 2 now, I didn't want to get, thank you, my babies. I'll send you pictures after.
Yes, of course.
I didn't want to patriotic clothes or anything like that, because it was a source of hurt for me. And this year I finally got outside. I finally became liberated enough from this stuff that I got outside of how I was looking at things, including how I was looking at like history and all this stuff. And I was like, no, I actually think that's how racism gets perpetuated, because like you were saying earlier, something about the sort of passing down and then adopting of the so-called Black experience. Mm-hmm. And the Black experience is written such that what people say and what they mean when they're saying that, they're talking about the experience of being in a racist society. They're talking about, an experience of being a descendant of formerly enslaved people and like all of these traumatic things. And I started thinking about how that trauma, which I don't use gently, that trauma, we pass it on to our kids in ways that we don't intend,
Right.
because we think it's to protect them,
Mhm.
right? And I had to see that for myself. It's been a long journey for me as well. I had to see that for myself and recognize that actually, in holding onto those feelings and passing it on to my kids and patting myself on the back and thinking that I'm doing them a service,
Right.
I was doing them a disservice, and I was doing myself a disservice. I love fireworks. I was like, and I love barbecues because I love food. Right. And I was like intentionally not, going to barbecues, not doing fireworks. Some of my only positive childhood memories were seeing fireworks on the 4th of July. And I'm going to take that away from my kids. All their friends in school, are going to be doing it. And I'm just going to be like, no, because because why? Right. And ask myself, like, why am I doing this? And why do I feel like it's something I have to do? And when I was doing the workshop, I caused this participant to cry, not on purpose, of course, but she cried. And I asked her about it afterwards, and she told me, she was like, that was really beautiful. And I never thought about it. I never really thought about it like that. I never thought about what I was passing on to my children. She had something like a 15-year-old and an 8-year-old. She's like, and I never questioned what I was passing on and the ideas and the pain or the hurt or the anger or any of those things. I just did because I felt like I had to, I felt like I should, I felt like I must. But based on what I know now, I wish to undo some of that harm, because I'm not a happier person for feeling all of the ways that I feel.
Right.
And I could tell based on the questions she was asking during the workshop that she felt the burden because she was internalizing it. And then she was feeling like racism was just in the air, like she can't escape it. And that's no way for any person to live. And there are philosophers who talk about racism as causing something called necrobeing. Leonard Harris, the mentor of my mentor, who writes about racism as causing a sort of living death, a necrobeing. And it's only this particular type of racism that happens in the Americas that causes this type of living death. And while he didn't create this, philosophical understanding to mean what I actually take it to mean now in terms of how I see the world, but I really see many people living a sort of living death. And I think the most tragic part about that is because it's preventable. For the most part, it's preventable. As it pertains to racism, it is preventable. And how we can prevent it is by really grappling with alternative philosophies of race and not insisting that we continue to work inside the box.
Right. This whole time, I'm thinking of, the metaphysical, I guess, philosophy of race, which is the skepticism, which is one of the three. And that is, things only exist if you believe they do. And so the second you let go of any attachment you have to something, it ceases to affect you, right? And so I think adopting racial skepticism is a helpful tool in these instances where you feel like you're holding on to such like hurt and such anger and when you just, I don't want to, my goal here is not to dismiss anybody's experiences, but the second you just let go of all of that, you realize like there's a whole world outside of that hurt and anger.
Yeah. And I think in a more clear-eyed fashion, you can become more astute in your understanding and awareness and analysis of racism, which then empowers us to actually problem solve and be part of the solutions, as opposed to creating racism to fight racism. And so the cycle goes, because very well-intended people are adopting such practices because they don't know that there's an alternative. I think that's also the the sort of undercurrent that's happening right now is people just don't think there are alternatives, because in the United States and Canada, nowhere, we haven't tried a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And it does give us the impression that the only way is to either reconstruct or conserve, keep it as it is, right? And there's no other way we can possibly do this. And skepticism isn't even on their radar. And some people kind of come to it by accident. I came to it by accident. It was just where my mind led me, and all of my research and my experiences and observations about, society. And people like yourself will then stumble upon, people who are speaking from a sort of skeptical positionality. But in terms of numbers, almost no one knows about skepticism. And that's where I think people like you and I being vocal matters. It's interesting, and I think this is part of the sort of uphill battle. So I'll bring this to your purview, within your purview, so you can be aware. But it's funny because I clearly define theory of racelessness in terms of skepticism and eliminativism. I have all these publications out. I say very succinctly the difference between skepticism and constructionism. And people will still say that I call it a social construction, but they'll get the eliminativism part, but they like completely miss the skepticism. Yeah. And I feel like I'm like, okay, well, they got the eliminativism part, which is a critical part, but I also think the skepticism is super critical, because if as we've been talking about, if you continue to operate as a constructionist and you teach our young people to be constructionists, you are teaching them to be inside the box of racism.
Still, yes.
And it's very, very hard for people to get out. And it's very hard to be a constructionist and recognize that you need to destroy the same thing that you probably have been taught to value, right? Because it's conflated with everything positive under the sun. And because it is this sort of metaphysical thing. And whereas if you're a skeptic, even if it takes you a long time to get there, you're not operating from within the category. Society, you recognize that society is going to racialize you. So I'm fully aware that people see me as Black, and that's fine. That doesn't make me feel compelled to see myself or think about myself or write myself as Black, because if I'm not anything, I'm not a hypocrite. So I practice what I preach.
Right.
I try to operate outside of the bounds. And in doing so, I benefit from being able to recognize racism where it is and not see myself in whatever that racism is. I'll give you an example. I can't think of a better one right now, but one example is between the difference, right? So on my campus, a racist incident happened this semester. It was my first semester there. And I heard that some students took bananas and put them in front of the door of an RA who was a racialized Black person. And the response to that was a lot of, they required all students living on campus to participate in DEI workshops, but it was just more of the same. Nothing transformative happened. I feel like they had an actual opportunity to do something impactful. And
DEI as in like diversity training?
Right, diversity, equity, and inclusion training, exactly. But it was more of the same, so it didn't actually help anything. I heard this feedback from other students, and actually they said, one of the students observed that the training was the same training she had to do at the start of the semester as like orientation for incoming students. So they didn't even do anything new. They just right. So there's that, and the students noticed. And there was a lot of this feelings of, now we have to protect the students of color, in quotation marks, and the racialized Black students. And we have to basically do damage control because now they all feel unsafe on campus. They recognize that racism is pervasive, it's everywhere, the school is racist, all of this stuff. And one of my students came up to me and asked me, Dr. Mase, I want to know how to stop internalizing this thing. Like, I want you to teach me that magic,
right?
because it seems like magic. I want to learn from you how to do that, because as it stands, you know, I've tended to interpret certain things like that incident in a particular way. And part of the narrative that went behind the incident, they're saying, you know, now students of color they see that they don't belong. They feel they don't belong here. They don't feel safe anymore on campus. It was just, to me, it was completely blown up. Isn't the exact way that I want to say it, but it was like, I didn't hear anyone saying how they were going to work with the students to help them grapple with the incident in a way that was liberatory.
Yes.
I didn't hear that, right? And that's where I felt like there was inadequacies, because it's one thing to, yes, hear how a person feels, right? Absolutely. And acknowledge how a person feels and honor how a person feels. But that doesn't mean that we have to, as listeners, or that we should encourage the student to continue to feel the way that they feel, if there's an alternative way to look at the thing. Because I told my class after the incident, I said, where do I belong on this campus? And they're all just looking at me. They're all looking at me. I said, do I have, you know, the ASU incident with the multicultural center came up too. So we're talking about like all the things.
Multiple, yeah.
And I was like, we have a multicultural center on campus, right? It's been renamed, but that center still exists, right? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, so is that where I belong? And they're just looking at me, and I'm like, do I belong in this classroom in front of you? And they're looking at me like, not wanting to fall into the trap, right? And I said, I belong wherever I go. And because some students think it's a good idea to get a pile of bananas and put them at the door of somebody's does not inspire me to now feel like I have to fear for my life on this campus. Because if we look at like the odds and the probabilities and statistics and all this other stuff would back up what I'm saying here. Like, the threat of violence was almost non-existent behind this banana shenanigans, right? It was just some kids being foolish, and they saw an opportunity to inspire fear, right? And to inspire feelings of not belonging. And in that way, they succeeded. You know, and why is it considered liberatory or productive to encourage any person to continue to feel that way about these different incidents? Because how they're feeling, it's less a recognition of the actors in this scenario are wrong, right? It's less a feeling or an assertion of these people, it's their problem that they don't see me in a particular way, whatever. And it's not me. As you were saying earlier, how your parents taught you to navigate the world. It's them, it's not me, right? It's more like we're encouraging people, and young people and old people alike, to think and to articulate in a way that it is me. It's because of who I am, and it's because of how I show up in a space that this person acts ignorant. There's a difference there. And that difference matters, because how that impacts you psychologically matters. And that is not a positive manifestation of, oh yeah, this is liberatory, this is a form of resistance, we have to speak out against racism and all this other stuff. No, it's not. It's packaged as liberatory, as I was saying earlier, but it's really detrimental. I belong wherever I go. And if you don't want me there, that's your problem.
Exactly.
It's your problem. And I have empathy for you. I can have empathy for you as a person who has deracialized herself. I can have empathy for you for feeling that way or thinking that way, because I see where that thinking comes from, and I see it less as a hate. I hear that word a lot. White people just hate Black people, right? Or they get all tied up in all these emotions, and I'm like, okay, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is it's just ignorance. It's just not knowing, not having experienced people who don't look like you, not having experienced people who participate in culture in a different way, not having read particular books, been exposed to certain information. It's ignorance, just not knowing. Or it's just ignorance in the sense of that person, for whatever personal reasons, really just needs to see themselves as above somebody else, because that can happen, right? And does happen. But I think for the majority of people, it's actually just ignorance, just not knowing. And because I know that, and I look at it from that perspective, I can have empathy for you, even though you're being vicious toward me, because I see your humanity, and I can see, like, I understand where that comes from, and it's solvable if we're intent about it, right? There is a solution. You don't have to stay in that state of ignorance.
Right. I have that same exact perspective on these kinds of situations. And I would even say, like, calling these kind of students racist is giving them way too much credit. This is like sheer stupidness. Like, it's not even like, I don't think it was that calculated. They saw an opportunity, like you said, to display some form of very bad practical joke that they thought probably was funny. And like you say, I have empathy for your ignorance. I see that you don't know, and I will grant you that. And that's just the end of the story. And I think when you said you didn't want to say that situation was blown out of proportion, but I would say it was, because it's, instead of addressing those students personally and only them, they projected that entire situation onto everybody else, and then created a psychological burden on for the Black and colored students on campus, which was so unnecessary. And so we see a lot of that on campus. Like, any kind of campus scandal resembles exactly that. And I don't understand why they go down like the white guilt route. It's like, it's right there, and it's like they just they get all frazzled, and that's what they do. But it's like, no, sit down and take the time to just deal with it at the individual level, and not yet the group, because sometimes it doesn't need to be at the group level. It needs to be directed at one or a couple of people. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, because for me, it's less the idea of it being blown out of proportion, and more the idea of, I disagree with how it was handled, right? Because I think it could have been handled in the ways that you're describing. And even if it was going to be a sort of systemic level, a group level, the way that you move forward in these scenarios, or a better way to move forward in these scenarios, isn't to encourage people not racialized as white to continue to see themselves as outsiders in a place where they're not outsiders, and they shouldn't be perceived as outsiders. That's one of the central benefits of adopting a sort of skeptical position versus any other position that has nothing to do with whiteness, as I was saying earlier, that people miss. Because I don't know, I feel like part of what gets overlooked in some ways, or diminished or devalued in some ways, is the negative impact of, you called it wokeness, some forms of woke ideals or ideology that have a detrimental impact on the participants that it's proposing to be helping. That to me is the rub. And that to me is something solvable. And maybe up until a certain point, not many of us realized what the solution was, but there are solutions out there now, such as theory of racelessness, and there are alternative ways to doing this that helps people. And it helps get to the systemic issues that people say they care about anyway, because in a lot of ways, racism is systemic in that too many people believe in the unicorn of race.
Mm-hmm.
And and in that way it's systemic. And in that way it's systemic because too many people see racism everywhere, even where it's not. It's systemic because we have problems that actually ail our societies, I should say, plural, being in two different countries. And those problems remain unchecked because we're continued to look for the racist boogeyman that's always supposed to be around the corner of whatever of every problem in society. And then that precludes us from actually having meaningful dialogue to solve the problems that we're proclaiming that we want to solve. I think there's a better path forward. And of course, I'm biased to my own ideas and work. I mean,
rightfully so.
But skepticism to me is important because I think you've pinpointed how it's fundamentally different from a constructionist position. But, for people that it's still potentially unclear, skepticism is not the same as constructionism, namely because constructionists will say race doesn't exist, but then they operate in the category. And then they look at a person and decide your race, or in ways that uphold naturalist ideas of race and in ways that render race real. Mm-hmm. The thing about constructionism is you believe race doesn't exist, but you believe it's real because of how racism manifests itself. So constructionists will say all the time to me, race doesn't exist, but I love my race, right? And society racializes me. And so in that way, race is real, even though they say it doesn't exist. There's a fundamental difference between that and me saying it doesn't exist, period. Yeah. It doesn't exist at all. We're misnaming racism or culture or ethnicity, and we're calling it race or racial. And in that way, race does not exist, period.
Yeah, I think, sorry, was I going to cut you off?
No, not at all.
I think constructionists?
Yes.
Okay. I think they're saying it doesn't exist as in biologically, but they acknowledge like the social aspect of race. So they're insisting on like, we're not like different subtypes of humans. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. They say it doesn't exist, but it exists in a constructed way. Right. Which is the same as saying it exists.
It's the same as it exists. And then right. Because when you look at the way race came about, it was because when, I'm going to simplify it again, but like the categories of race were constructed to back up racist pseudoscience. So like self-proclaimed American and European scientists were like, okay, we need to justify our exploitation of other people. And so let's create these categories and let's say that it's because they have different shapes of their skulls and the brain size and so forth. And so let's create like red, white, yellow, and then black. And then we just ran with it. It continued to stay in the meaning changed, but the categories stayed. And I don't understand why we haven't clicked yet that it's like, this is what's causing the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like the reason why it hasn't clicked yet for many people is because when you're in the fishbowl, it's really hard to see the fishbowl.
Right.
It's hard to see the fishbowl.
Right.
Almost impossible. You get some people along the way historically who have done their best to see the fishbowl and describe it to other people. and and then they're lambasted as being racist or anti-Black, right? And then the quagmire continues because it's really hard to see the fishbowl when you're in the fishbowl.
Right.
But I feel really heartened and inspired talking with folks like yourself, and you know, being sort of in relationship with all of the other people that you listed at the outset in terms of thinking. People I'm really hoping to talk with, like Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, are on my list of people I'm really wanting to speak with.
Well, John McWhorter's book, his new book came out, Woke Racism. I need to get it. I think.
Yes. Truth be told, I haven't read it yet, but I've seen a lot of interviews that he's done promoting it.
Yeah.
And I need to read it because then that could be a way to get him on my channel to talk with me. So let's talk about the book.
Yes, absolutely.
Although he agreed before his book came out, he agreed to talk with me, but he was like, the book, I'm finishing the book and it's gonna come out and I'm really busy right now, but like, let's say late fall. And then I think he's just been so massively busy that it hasn't happened, but I'm optimistic.
The book is a good segue to get him on the channel for sure.
I want to give you an opportunity, Violette, since we are here, and this is an increasingly rare opportunity to make time to speak together. Do you have any other questions or anything you're like itching to talk more about?
Everything. I'm sure I might wake up with some more tomorrow, and then if that's the case, I'll send them to you. But no, I think we've covered everything I wanted to talk about for sure. Yeah.
Awesome. That's really good to hear. Let me see if anyone has any more questions in the chat. The same person asked again if you have a channel, but I'll restate that she doesn't have a channel, but she has a Substack, which she's going to be active on sooner than later. So I'm going to share that link in the description box. You'll just have to come back to get it. Let's see. Yes, Mike, I agree. Mike, the dad Crosby, says no one will ever be able to convince everyone to believe the same thing. Right.
That's true. Yes.
Unless it's literally by force, which in some ways I see what's happening in society is sort of seeming to be by force.
Bullying, right? For sure. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if your livelihood is threatened and you have people who will silence themselves just out of fear, as we were talking about earlier. And so it's this weird cycle of racism. Right. Ultimately, it's this weird cycle of racism. Let's see. Oh, Scotty, my friend Scotty says, welcome, Violette.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Sweet. Let's see. Chloe says, seems like there should be a group for racialized Black girls being rejected by their Black peers for not being Black enough.
A support group for sure.
I think Chloe, knowing Chloe, she would be in the group. You would be in the group. I would be in the group.
Yes.
My new acquaintance Otto would be in the group. It at some point it's like almost every racialized Black person would be in the group.
Yeah.
And then maybe more eyes would open.
Yes.
To the reality of all of this.
Right.
Let's see. So Nita says, I want to scream from the mountaintops. Privilege is granted by someone, so who's granting it? Maybe stop granting it. I think that was when we're talking about how people might accuse you or I as having some sort of privilege in terms of having fairer skin. Isn't it interesting that this is making me think about how privilege, I might just be having a moment right now. An epiphany. Yeah. This is making me think about how privilege has become synonymous with not being on the receiving end of racism.
But if you're not subject to racism, you're privileged, not like automatically?
Right. Because
I think
there's the thing white privilege. That's how people typically mean it.
Yes.
And when people talk about white privilege, I've kind of come around to feeling like it's a myth, and it's part of the mythology of racialist ideology that keeps racism and racialist ideology moving forward. Because whiteness has never, from the beginning construction of it, whiteness has not meant to benefit all people who are racialized as white, right? There's a class aspect to this that gets left out of the conversation all the time. And that's one of the points of contention for many people who are racialized as white today, who say, what are you talking about privilege? You know, like, I came from nothing, my family came from nothing, or, you know, my family immigrated in the 60s or 70s. So my ancestors weren't even here back when slavery was happening and all this other stuff. So, but then the response is, well, white privilege doesn't mean that we think that all white people are privileged. It just means that their lives are easier because of their whiteness, because racism operates in the ways that it does to benefit so-called white people. I'm like, okay, but if we continue to try to translate that and follow the logic, then isn't that essentially the same as saying people who aren't on the receiving end of racism, as society would define it, right? Because society will tell you that white people can't experience racism. That's the commonly accepted definition. White people can't experience racism, power plus privilege, right? So Black people can't be racist. That's what not my ideas, people, not my ideas. That's what people think, right? And so power plus privilege. Yeah. I mean, so basically privilege is is in simple terms is not being on the receiving end of racism, which is why it gets assigned to this idea of whiteness. So then when somebody like yourself comes along and you say, you know, you say, okay, I'm mixed culturally, I'm mixed ethnically, and I'm privileged in the sense of I haven't experienced racism in the ways that other people, like my mom, who look a different way, experience it. And in the same way that one of my students can ask me and feel like they're going to be right, that maybe I think the way that I do because of colorism, because I've not experienced racism, which they learned that they were very wrong about that, the presumption, but the idea that I would think this way because I haven't experienced racism is a presumption of privilege. I don't know if this is an epiphany or if I'm just saying what people already say.
The thing is, when I said I'm privileged, I took into account my class to a certain extent. So the way I live, the neighborhood I live in, the schools I attended, it's, you would say, arguably like upper middle to upper class type of environment. So when I say I'm privileged, it's a very in a class sense of the word privilege. And I think to tie in the two, I think CLR James says, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but he says, we cannot talk about race without talking about class. The two are connected. So, and I think that would be a helpful way to think about privilege as well. It's not just about how you look, it's also like your positionality in society.
Oh, so first of all, I smiled when you mentioned CLR James because if I'm remembering correctly, he's the author of Minty Alley, which is one of my favorite books of all time. So I think that that's how some people conceive of privilege, but the more people you talk to, you come to find that they're not including the class component to it. Because, you know, when you have Oprah Winfrey, a billionaire, saying, don't feel bad for white people because they still have their whiteness, for poor white people because they still have their whiteness, there is this constant and consistent discounting the fact that not all racialized white people live cushy lives just because they're
their
white.
Skin color. It makes
right.
Sense. Yeah.
And so, but when you give that kind of pushback, then the argument becomes, okay, we concede the fact that white people have struggles, they can have hard lives, right? They can be poor. but their lives are still easier compared to people who are racialized in other ways because they don't have the discrimination working against them. Mm-hmm. I'm like, okay. And so quite literally, the privilege isn't about class, although that's certainly a meaning of it, right? And that's how I would talk about my own privilege in some ways in the here and now. But it really is more about just the privilege to not experience racism, which is why today, when you have people arguing in the public sphere till they're blue in the face that white people can't experience racism, this is ultimately at the core of it. This tying of systemic racism operating against a particular racialized group in ways that it does not work against people racialized as white. That's ultimately the privilege.
Mm-hmm. But then again, I think putting it that way, you're missing a lot of the nuance of privilege. I think just viewing it as not being on the receiving end of racism, I think absolves the fact that your status in life will also bring you certain privilege. If one day I become Oprah, like Oprah has status, so she is privileged, whereas a white person who doesn't have Oprah status, they will experience some form of discrimination. If it's not racially, it might be class-wise.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, you and I agree that it's not the best way to define the thing.
Right.
But that seems to be the way that the
people go about it.
The mainstream narrative, is defining it, because only in America can you have a billionaire like Oprah Winfrey. I'll say it again. Say, yeah, I'm a billionaire, but don't feel bad for poor white people because they still have their whiteness.
Right.
Or LeBron James sobbing on social media because somebody painted, a racist slur on his driveway or whatever that scenario was. And that's part of the nefariousness of racism, as I was describing it earlier, because it's this internalization, and it's the internalization that then causes people to carry it with them everywhere, despite their circumstances and despite whatever they've transcended, despite whatever, systemic racism one can transcend, because racism continues to operate in the ways that it does, and because liberation starts first with the individual in our minds, it is producing these sort of reverberations of people who, by all definitions, I think, are privileged. And they can have that privilege and they can have that class status and they can still sob over, you know what I'm saying? Because what's being carried with that is all of the trauma and all of the history, all of the things that are written into race, and especially Blackness. It's all carried with a person. You don't ever stop being Black, right? They're saying, the mainstream saying is, I have to do two things: stay Black and die, right? So it's, if that's the case, then because racism camouflages itself as race, then it really does encourage, and I think in some ways force people to carry racism with them everywhere.
There you go.
And that's, to me, that's quite the opposite of liberation. It's the opposite of how we should be working to resolve and unify and heal. It's the opposite of what people are professing this way of thinking, this form of thinking is, which is freeing. It's not freeing. It's not a form of resistance. It's literally subscribing to the trap caused by racism. In two ways, both individually and systemically, because one recognizes that race is assigned to you from society, and you also racialize yourself. And in that way, it's just continues to seem inescapable. And I know more people than not who are very pessimistic about the possibility of ever overcoming or transcending racism. And, you know, those people are right if we continue down this path of holding on to race ideology.
Mm-hmm.
They're right. Because, you know, as we've tried to lay out a little bit here today, if we hold on to the concept of race, we're carrying racism with it in ways that are, you know, we can't rewind the clock, but we can imagine a different future, and we can proceed in a manner that actually stems this at its root, which I think is probably a good natural place to stop.
Agreed.
Well, Violette, I truly enjoyed having you today. This has been my pleasure, 100%. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'm a fan, so this is like a dream. I'm really happy I was having this conversation. Hopefully we have more. And just
definitely
for everybody for tuning in, I guess.
Yes, definitely. I'm holding you to it. We'll definitely have more. We're linked on IG now. I'm going to send you the Discord information. We're going to get you in there, introduce you to all my peoples. You probably circulate a lot, and you can advertise your Substack. And
yes, absolutely.
I can't wait to see your first essay. Like, I feel like that's going to be a moment. So
yes, I'm still nervous. It's still in the works. I have a draft, but I'm nervous to put it out. But I think now I've gotten the little courage to do so.
Good. Yeah. Awesome. If I don't see it, do you have a deadline? Is this something you're planning on launching come New Year, or?
I will try and do it before Christmas. If not, it's going to be January for sure.
Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna put it on my calendar to follow up with you if I don't see it.
Yeah, that'll give me a little nudge.
I can't wait. Thank you again, and thank you to everyone for joining us, chiming in the chat box. I can't wait to catch up on what everyone was saying. I'll be back again very, very soon. The semester is over, so I have more time to invest in making content and doing Q&As. That's something I want to start as well, a series. I'll come on here live. You can come and ask me questions until we don't have any more questions to answer. Thanks for everyone's support. I appreciate you. Love, light, and liberation. Bye, everyone.